All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Ashley. For those of you who do not know me, I'm a senior research manager at Hit Strategies, and I lead the equity team's portfolio of work, which of course covers young voters, which we'll be going over a bit today. Really excited to kind of dive into some of our theories here, especially ahead of the midterms and hopefully with enough time uh, to help others who may be working on that and some larger theories to help us as we enter primary season next year with the general election. Next slide, please. So a little bit about why we're here. Oh, and real quick, I realize if you have any questions, please feel free to use the question and answer feature up top. You'll see the little chat box that says Q&A. You can submit them there and we'll answer questions at the end. So please feel free to drop some in there. All right, so a little bit about why we're here and the Gen Z dilemma. For those of you who don't know, close to 50 million young people between the ages of 18 and 29 will be eligible to vote in the 2026 midterms. Once you add in millennials to that Gen Z cohort of eligible voters, that's on track to make up roughly half of the eligible voting bloc in the country by the midterms. So that's a really large group of people, and so definitely a group that we need to better understand, especially as they continue to age every year more and more into our voting electorate. And then especially when you look at our last election in 2024, about half of Gen Z did not feel motivated enough to turn out to vote. And those are not great numbers, and we like to see something a bit more. And especially looking at the headlines that came out of 2024 election, we saw that young men, and that was kind of the focal point, I feel like, especially when it came to young voters, they moved towards Trump and Republicans in their vote choice more than we've ever seen in any other election for that kind of age cohort typically. We also know, since we started at HIT, that campaigns have not been reaching Gen Z, and not just Gen Z, I'm going to say young voters overall, because millennials were also part of that young voter cohort for quite a while, and many of them still are when we're looking at ages 34 and under. Some of our oldest millennials are now age 46, so that's almost anyone under the age of 50 that falls into that definition. But we've been missing young voters when it was even millennials because a lot of this online engagement that we don't fully understand and don't are still kind of trying to figure out how to properly engage with. So we have a couple theories that we want to offer up to the smart audience of clients of ours and other researchers in the field to kind of figure out how we can best engage with young people and start to work together to find some new solutions moving forward. A little bit about the HIT team, for those of you who don't know HIT. We are a public opinion research firm that specializes in hard-to-reach communities that are actively reshaping everything we know about politics and the eligible voting bloc. We are a firm that represents the age ranges and cultural diversity of the emerging electorate, meaning we bring a cultural competency to the work that we don't often see in some of our other political democratic firms. I most often hear from our clients that what sets us apart from other firms is our creativity and willingness to try new things. We all come from the academic rigor and research background, which has long established that for any new technologies, any new approaches for doing anything, it usually has to come after years and years of testing. However, we do acknowledge some flaws of our great academic community, and we propose taking on some of the more creative approaches right away to better understand and get at many of our research objectives. And I think that that will kind of show through in this this presentation here, especially as we're just kind of giving a top line overview of some of our work. We most often, in most of our other work, you'll usually see much more intense breakdowns, a ton of data on all of our slides that shows you how each subgroup is operating and any trends that we're noticing amongst those subgroups. In this case, for the purpose of this presentation, just so we're not throwing too much information at you at once, we're going to actually stay a little bit top level when it comes to young voters, name just a few differences, but we definitely encourage you to reach out to us if you'd like to hear more about any subgroup differences and additional research, because we definitely have it. but for those of you who are familiar with us, sorry that it's going to look a little bit different. And now I'm going to introduce my lovely co-presenters and fellow team members of the equity team, Erica Tebbs and Michelle Whitlock, who will both be presenting today. We specialize in young voters, policy advocacy messaging such as healthcare and abortion, as well as LGBTQ audiences and crime and policing, just to name a few. Next slide, please. And I would just like to do a little thank you to all of our clients. Here's just a few. And of course, a special shout out to our top row, which is our most recent young voter clients. They have the data and the qualitative insights from our research. And that's a lot of their work is what allows us to present some of this to you today. So even with the client work that may not be public, we'll use some public sources. So you might see some of those citations here. But all of our analysis is our own, and we're really excited to share that with you. So also thank you to all of our fellow clients. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Erica to give a little bit of an overview of Gen Z before we jump into some of these larger theories.
Thanks, Ashley. So with this Gen Z landscape, we just have a high-level overview of some Gen Z trends politically, socially, and digitally. So first, politically, Gen Z's interaction with politics looks a lot different than previous generations. A lot of their ideology exists outside the lines of the two-party system, and their engagement goes beyond politics. While Gen Z is identifying less with any major political party, Democrats are losing ground with Gen Z, and young 2026 primary voters are choosing candidates that are challenging the establishment mold and focusing on solutions to everyday problems they're facing. Next, socially, Gen Z has the reputation of being the loneliest generation, which of course impacts mental health, general life satisfaction. Many experienced the height of the COVID pandemic during what are usually formative periods of development socially, and the boom of social media at such a critical point in their lives also shapes the way that they connect with each other, what they consider to be community. Many online youth having online communities, but lacking such in their lives offline. And that leads us to also talk about Gen Z's media consumption. Gen Z is very online. They have been so steeped in online culture from a young age that they navigate it with fluency. But just because they use social media so often and rely on it as their most up-to-date source of information doesn't mean that they fully trust everything they see. In fact, they know they need to have a critical eye when it comes to the information they come across online. They're often the first to recognize AI slop when they see it. They're the first to ask about sources and question the origin of the content they're seeing. And we'll get a little bit more into their fact-checking habits later in this presentation too. Now, to dig in just a little bit more to Gen Z's relationship with politics, we see a lot of signs that they want to disrupt the status quo, both politically and economically, which they really see working hand in hand. They're more likely than any other generation to identify as independent, even if they still vote for Democrat or Republican candidates. Refusing to identify with these traditional political parties tells us that they do not feel represented fully by these parties and see the flaws that pervade the system itself. They don't necessarily trust that the agendas of parties and most politicians are focused on the betterment of their own lives, and generally find them to be out of touch with the reality of what it is to be a young person today. This is where we hear a lot of the lesser of two evils and both sidesism happening among Gen Z when it comes to how political parties and the establishment functions. Regardless of who's elected, they think that there's some major structural reform that is needed in government. We often hear Gen Z call out the two-party system, the electoral college, the influence that wealthy donors and corporations have on politics as evidence that the powers that be are not working in their best interest. They see these systemic factors as barriers to really being able to have a meaningful say in what happens in politics and government, and therefore, to some extent, what happens in their own lives and futures. The perception of their own power to make change, of course, then impacts their civic engagement, turnout at elections, and the way that they approach politics in general. This is often where we start to hear the misconception that Gen Z is disengaged, they don't care, but they do about many issues. They're just questioning how much change they can really make through the traditional pathways they've been offered as they exist today. And this lack of faith in the political system as an avenue to make change, change that responds to their needs, is often the root of why we see a lot of young people taking action outside of the electoral system, where they're trying to have more of an impact, for example, by participating in a boycott or community-based actions like mutual aid. Socially, Gen Z is really searching for a sense of belonging in community. Some Zoomers report lacking a sense of community at all or are actively looking for one. In the meantime, they are finding community online. We often hear this from youth that may not have anyone in their immediate surroundings that they feel really understands them, but then they feel this sense of camaraderie and shared experience in a subreddit or relate to content that they see on TikTok. Despite having online outlets, there is a craving for more interaction and connection IRL. Ironically, you can see evidence of this on social media. So trends related to nostalgia for a more analog life, the return of Polaroids, disposable cameras, print zines, even dumb phones and screen time monitoring apps. Gen Z yearns for tangible third spaces that don't require money to hang out with friends. And they're often experiencing some burnout from social media and dating apps, which also leads us to another interesting social trend among Gen Z, that many are decentering romantic relationships. And Gen Z is facing some unique struggles in dating today, and we'll expand a little bit more on why this may be later in the presentation. But spoiler alert, the context of all in which you live and what came before you plays a role, including financial stability, the ideological gender gap, laws threatening reproductive rights and the safety of LGBTQ people, and more. Now, to dive in a little bit more on Gen Z trends in media, it is no secret that Gen Z spends a lot of time online. Social media is the way that they get their information, political news, what's happening locally, nationally, globally. But the information that they received is often in a passive way, so scrolling and stopping on things that interest them. And in that way, of course, the content that they're exposed to is really guided by algorithms. And they're often opening these apps not actively looking for news, but coming across it anyway. They will do further searching on a topic, whether through comment sections, a Google search, checking across different pages and platforms for more information if they're interested in or skeptical about what they're seeing. Overall, Gen Z is well versed in the world of the internet. They're aware that not everything they see is true, and they engage in fact checking habits more than other generations, which we'll expand upon later. And as Ashley mentioned, it's also important to keep in mind that Gen Z is not a monolith. In this discussion today, we're focusing on broad trends among Gen Z and the through lines culturally, socially, and politically that connect them. But of course, there's so many unique lived experiences shaped by identity among different groups within Gen Z that impacts the way they interact with politics and the world around them. For example, some of Gen Z is still in high school, while others are entering the job market at the boom of AI. Some have never known a world without smartphones. Others remember the dawn of social media, myself included. They're one generation, but with different cultural zeitgeists. Gen Z is also the most racially diverse generation, but there are disparities by race in Gen Z voter turnout. So young voters of color are less represented at the polls. Also, in ideology, Black and Latino youth have tended to vote more Democrat than white youth, but Black and Hispanic young men, are also splintering away from Democrats. And young Latino men had the most drastic shift from voting Biden in 2020 to Trump in 2024. So, this ideological gender gap between young men and young women exists across race, with young men moving more to the right and young women moving more to the left. Overall, as Ashley mentioned, Gen Z is just a very interesting generation and makes up a substantial portion of the electorate that's worth investing in and mobilizing. When we do invest in and connect with Gen Z, they turn out in huge numbers and can lead a movement from the ground up, like we saw in New York's mayoral election recently. But when we don't speak to them authentically or respond to their needs, we risk losing Gen Z voters that are largely aligned on a progressive agenda. And we miss this opportunity to uplift a generation that is so formative to the future of our country. So I'll pass it back to Ashley to help us understand more about who Gen Z is and how to connect with them.
Thanks, Erica. So now that we've learned a bit of background on Gen Z and who they are, I'd like to get into one of our latest theories on young voters. So while there's been a ton of conversation about young men since 2024 and how they may be leaning a bit more conservative and some conservative trends we've been seeing amongst young people, I'd like to offer you a different explanation to the trend that we've been witnessing. It's that young voters are actually much more anti-establishment and are seeking out those candidates that that classically attribute those anti-establishment traits to themselves, that kind of break the box and the norms that we're used to from politicians. And that's what's going into a lot of the differences that we're seeing. For example, you'll see there's been a tension among young voters who both increasingly favor Trump back in 2024 and increasingly prefer progressive candidates when they turn out in droves for certain primary elections. So what do we do with the fact that we have these two trends existing at one time, where it's extremely conservative and then extremely progressive amongst the same cohort? What we're actually seeing when we do talk to young voters is that when they do turn out to vote and are feeling motivated or motivated when they're in between two candidates, it comes down to a lot of the candidates' traits. It comes down to the candidates that are willing to say it like it is, not act like a buttoned-up politician, to call out corporate power and greed and say, I'm going to make something better and different for young people, something that's completely different from the status quo, not just the classic policy points that we normally see recited back to us. And that's why we see people both supporting Trump and AOC at the same time, if you're in that district. And that's why we see some of this as well, where they also turn out for our very progressive candidates in some of these elections. So to get into this a bit more, I want to talk a little bit about the quote system that we often hear young voters talk about. I'm sure you all have heard it before. We often talk about it in regards to our voting and election system, democracy, all of that jazz. But in reality, it's actually one word I like to say, or words that they use to describe everything. They use it to describe our economic system, their career ladder, how they're going to make money. They use it to describe the housing market, how they'll be able to purchase a house or get a rental. They use it to kind of describe everything because they look at the system as rigged and rigged against them. And that's why they really want to see a candidate that speaks to turning the whole system on its head. So Gen Z is highly aware of the power of corporations and the 1% in society, both in politics and their own lives. So they want candidates to speak to this, to more explicitly state it so that they can trust that you will actually go out and change the system rather than be owned by it once you're elected. They're also distrusting of outdated institutions in politics, economics, and culture. They've watched it fail themselves and many of their parents as well. They're very, very self-aware of the fact that salaries have not kept up with cost of living. I mean, as far back as the 80s, before most of them were were born. And they're very aware of that. So they really want this system to be changed. And that's why we talk about the system even beyond voting, and economics, if you will. Looking at 2024 more specifically and some of the lessons that we learned there, unfortunately, that campaign confirmed a lot of young voters' concerns and the high levels of jadedness that they had. And that's going to have major implications for trust building for future elections, both for motivating young voters to turn out, to trust the system, to trust that their vote does count and matters, and for motivating them to vote for a certain candidate or not. So the backdoor handoff of candidacy that we saw happen from Biden to Harris without any additional elections kind of confirmed to these jaded young voters that their vote really didn't matter in this process. They always believe that there is a bit of a puppet master going on in the background. They like to call the establishment that we're using here shorthand, I guess. And that really kind of pulled the curtain back on them and exposed and exposed the Democratic Party in the eyes of young voters, that is. That's how they really feel that it's happening, and it confirmed a lot of their biggest fears. Then when we looked at a little bit about how the campaign functioned in the very short 2.5, 3 months that we did have, the campaign was centered on Project 2025 and the threat of Donald Trump. It was the threat of what Trump would do rather than what Harris could offer young voters. Trump, yes, we're also getting the slides. Trump talked a lot about this glowy future that he is offering young people and really everyone. He talked a lot to the specifics and the day-to-day details that will change under his presidency. And that's what a lot of jaded young people were looking for at the time. On the other hand, more classically Democratic or Dem-leaning young people who would typically turn out to vote in a 2024 election weren't feeling very motivated because of the feeling of this establishment and puppet master approach. And then having the messaging just be on the status quo and a vote for me because I'm not the worst candidate, it really didn't speak to young people or motivate them in any way. And when to that point, when Democrats are seen as defenders of the status quo, that is failing Gen Z, and therefore the candidate fails in winning their vote. But when leaders authentically challenge the system, prioritize delivering solutions on day-to-day needs, like the specific details of what in their lives will change, and offer an alternate vision of the future, then they really succeed. And I do want to clarify that for this last point, there's a difference between a Hillary Clinton approach of what we see or what we saw in 2016 of 10-page long policy papers about how we're going to achieve universal healthcare and healthcare changes versus quick quips that young voters can kind of share and quickly get the idea of. Something that we heard spoken back to us a lot in a lot of focus groups, even far outside of New York City, was a lot of quotes from Mamdani. And a lot of what he said was, well, we're feeling, for one example, one of the things we heard was, we're feeling the system is really hard right now. The cost of living is rising. So I'm going to make sure that public transportation is free. And that's one less thing that you'll have to worry about under my mayoralship. And that's a lot of what we heard back. And that's from voters all the way out in Nevada who have no implication from New York City. So that says a lot for the type of vision that we're looking for in this messaging. We don't need to get in the weeds of the details, but we need just a bit enough information to kind of prove that we do have a strategy, like we have an idea here for your future and how we're going to achieve it, and showing you that what that glowy future could look like. Now to get into just a little bit more about the young voters' ideal candidates overall. Like I said at the top of this, it's all about breaking that establishment mold, especially now after the 2024 election. We have a long way to go to reestablish some of this trust. So when we ask young voters, and this is across the ideological spectrum, we do have folks, including some of our most right-leaning young voters, point to AOC and the tenacity and fight that she has and demonstrates. They want that level of fight for the person that they're going to put in office to establish their vision for young people. That is overwhelmingly what we hear from people. And to that point, I'm going to jump over to down below the willing and ready to challenge corporate power and ultra wealthy, because I feel these two go hand in hand, which is why AOC is so referenced, and now Mamdani in our latest focus groups. And again, it's referenced, I just can't emphasize this enough, by our right-leaning young voters. They are referencing these socialist candidates themselves as really good ideas for candidates for the future. And they're saying because they actually specifically name corporate power, they name them as their villain and who they're going to go after publicly. They also name the ultra wealthy as their villain. They're going to even out and fix the system. That speaks a lot to young voters, in part because they feel like making that public statement, naming the public villain for them, is going to go a long way in holding them accountable in their own way. They feel they might be less likely to be bought out once they are in office, and hopefully they will deliver on these promises. One of the other pieces that we had raised, because we most often see young people saying, I want to see more young people, but I do want to add that there's a piece to that they're a little bit more realistic than that. It's not just about a young person and the youngest person you can find to throw in office. For them, they're looking for a shorter, more community-oriented career, similar to that of first-term Obama when he was running for president. It's just enough of a background in politics and experience to know how to navigate the system, to know how to navigate the legislative system as a president who shouldn't have legislative power, to get things done and to fight on behalf of you, but not long enough that you could be considered a career politician and kind of bought and sold by the classic campaign finance pieces that we often see recited back to us in some of our focus groups. Next, we often hear that young voters are looking for someone that comes from more of a working class family upbringing. They're really tired of seeing candidates who were born and raised in ultra wealthy families, went to boarding schools, and clearly believe that they were put on this earth to be president and that we owe this to them. They really want someone who they feel can understand what it's like to work for a dollar, and understand the real struggles of the average American family. And lastly, to kind of pound this home, since I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but it is very important. In part of messaging on all of these pieces, they want to see all of this messaging authentically communicated on the future that they seek for the average working class people. So again, to what I said a little bit about the Mamdani example, it needs to be authentic. And I think actually these memes on the right-hand side do a good example of this, of here in the green, this is an example of when memes and things go viral or in a good way that helps us, not necessarily saying, hey, let's go have some candidates put these memes out themselves. We can rely on messengers. This isn't a good example from the 2016 election of memes gone wrong, and how it comes off inauthentic. Hillary Clinton, as much as we love her, we realized that maybe the best way to engage with young people wasn't to have her be the messenger when talking about Pokemon go to the polls. It didn't land right because it felt wrong and inauthentic. The best approach here might be having the messengers be young people themselves, interns on the campaign who have a following. I know influencers weren't as much of a thing back then, but now they're big. It's using those messengers to talk to their peers rather than trying to set Hillary up as a young, relatable candidate, and just being really real about who she is and what she has to offer. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Michelle.
Thanks, Ashley. So I'm going to delve into our next thesis, which is Gen Z wants to see a government that puts people over profit. So we know Gen Z is anti-establishment, but what do they actually want? We did a survey last year to probe more into this, and we found that Gen Z is very aligned with the progressive agenda. They want a strong social safety net and to help people get out of poverty. They want to fight racism and discrimination. They want clean air, water, and land. They want affordable healthcare. They want to hold employers and corporations accountable. At least 8 in 10 want the government to play a role in each of these. They want a government that works for them, not for billionaires and not for corporations. But I want to pause and focus more on this climate as an example of the importance of how we frame these issues to the young voters. Messaging matters. Republicans have effectively politicized the term climate change with conspiracy theories and their own messaging. 69% of Gen Z says that they want actions that address climate change, which is a high number, but we can do better than that. It's also worth calling out that Gen Z women are 13 percentage points more likely than Gen Z men to want to see actions that address climate change. However, when we reframe the issue addressing climate change to ensuring clean land, air, and water, now 95% of Gen Z voters say the government should play a role in this, and that gender gap shrinks to only 7 points. So what about the other side? Harvard did a survey of 18 to 29-year-olds last year to gauge support for key components of Trump's agenda. We see pretty strong opposition to ICE, tariffs, and ending DEI programs. Trump ran on trying to fix the economy in 2024 and make it work for working people. Now he is neglecting the cost of living crisis and exacerbating the economic issues that he ran on that Gen Z was already dealing with 2 years ago. So it's no wonder that Gen Z feels the American dream is getting harder and harder and harder to achieve. Last year, we did some research on this topic, and we found that a majority of Gen Z voters associate the American dream with financial stability, home ownership, freedom, education, and their own health and well-being. A majority agree that the American dream was achievable for their parents. A smaller majority agree that it's achievable for themselves, but only about half think that the next generation can attain it. And we noticed that Gen Z women were far more pessimistic about the American dream than men. So why is this? Erica alluded to this earlier. Gen Z came of age and entered the workforce during a really challenging economy. This decade, we've seen COVID, AI, inflation, student debt, and a really tough job market, especially for entry-level employees. So while the 2024 elections were a referendum on Biden's economy, people are now impatient with the new administration. A Generation Lab survey this year found that most adults under 30 primarily blame Trump and corporations for poor economic conditions, not Biden, not congressional Democrats. So when we think about how to position ourselves, we really need to make sure we demonstrate that Democrats want to protect ordinary people, fight greed, and focus on what matters. Again, our research demonstrates that Gen Z prioritizes financial security and their health most. I think it's worth calling out that young people don't prioritize friendships, romantic relationships, or children as much as their finances or their health, which is really interesting because in other generations, this is the age in someone's life when people are going out, meeting new people, experiencing new things, dating, dating, marriage, thinking about children. But again, let's think about the new social, political, and economic climate that Gen Z is currently facing. Gen Z grew up as the country became more politically and socially unstable. They saw a rise in school shootings, ICE raids, the election of Donald Trump, and the murder of George Floyd. Also, a lot of people who are thinking about marriage and raising a family are probably also thinking about their finances. The stereotypical American dream is of a family with a stable job and a nice house. But as we discussed earlier, job stability and home ownership are increasingly out of reach. We keep seeing these apocalyptic headlines about climate change and the impacts that this will have on our economy and food and water supply, which is probably also giving people some pause. We have this meme on the right that I think really exemplifies this point about people complaining about other people not having children, but then there's me just staring into this green, disgusting, polluted abyss. The institutions that are supposed to be helping young people are in fact making it harder for them, with the government continuing to cut our social safety net and deregulate climate initiatives. It's also getting harder and harder to think about family planning in a post-Roe world where people really need to think about which state they live in to ensure reproductive rights and LGBTQ plus rights. So on that really cheery note, I'm going to hand it back to Ashley.
Thanks, Michelle. I can't say I'm going to get much more cheery than that, but I'm going to move in a little bit more to the media piece here and some myth busting on this topic. So we often hear Gen Z gets so much flack, and I'll get into that in a moment, but I want to start on the fact that we can identify and clearly say that Gen Z is incredibly media literate in an era of misinformation and disinformation. They grew up in this online ecosystem, so they know how to navigate it very well. People say that Gen Z can't discern fact from fiction. I couldn't believe it with some of the headlines that we were seeing, how Gen Z became the most gullible generation and Gen Z's problem with fake news. These are things I was often seeing when meanwhile we're looking at statistics of which generation is it, the one that's most likely to get scammed online? It's certainly not Gen Z. Next slide, please. Just to get into a little bit more on this. Young voters are actually especially likely to fact check political information they find online. So when they're scrolling through social media, we know that they most often stumble upon political information or news. They're never really searching it out most of the time. They just happen to find it. And when they do, it's not something that they always want to deep dive research on. So I think that's why they're not always searching it out. But when we ask them specifically about like their likelihood to follow up and fact check, for instance, this first one here, I have checked whether something I saw online is true. We have 81%. I have compared online content about the same topic across more than one source, 72%. And I take steps to find out who created the content I view online to understand the messenger, 53%. This is all data from talking about Gen Z and a little bit of millennials up to our age 34 cohort. So that just goes to show that maybe Gen Z isn't the generation we should be looking at for a lot of the media literacy issues. Next slide, please. In fact, young adults are less likely to trust news from chatbots than older adults are. Something that we've started to find in a lot of our qualitative work that I'm going to expand on a little bit more, that I'd like to see a lot of additional work on, because if this is as far-reaching as we think it might be, this could completely rechange what we think and know about our digital strategy when it comes to engaging with young people. We're finding that Gen Z often turns to the comment sections to try to aggregate the truth. It's kind of like the quick top of mind way or quick way to look at it. Think of it as when you're tired after work or after school and you're scrolling on your phone, you see something interesting that you weren't expecting. You're not necessarily going to close that app and open Safari and start doing a deep dive research on the topic unless something really crazy came across your screen. You're most likely opening the comments to see if other people are accusing that person of AI or fake content, or if people are supporting it, opposing it, disagreeing, or anything about the messenger and whether or not it should be trusted if it's a news source that's coming across your screen. A new source, not to be confused with news source, sorry. And so this is definitely an area that we want to continue to expand research on, because if the comment sections are the case, I know that's not most of what our digital strategy includes. And if this is the case, then we need to completely rethink where we're spending our time and energy in our digital outreach when it comes to targeting young people specifically, because we need to be in those comment sections to be able to help validate the messages and messengers we're trying to put out there. So a little bit more on this, and to maybe add some urgency to this problem I'm trying to flag for you all. When we look at non-political media spaces, they're currently dominated by right-leaning ideology. So like I said earlier, young people are getting online and they're not seeking out and purposely following political people in terms of the majority, of course. I'm going to leave out my fellow political nerds that was following all of that back in the day, myself included, and my 2016 Hillary Clinton poster on my college walls. I had to give a little something back to Hillary Clinton after shaming her. Sorry about that. So aside from our classic political nerds, we know that the majority of Gen Z is actually not trying to spend much time online. looking and seeking for political information. In fact, it's supposed to be an escape for them from the doom and gloom reality that we're kind of facing in our constant news cycle that we all feel. So when they do turn online, and also to online show sources. So when I say online shows, that's a little bit like, that's like podcasts that I'm talking about. It's a lot of folks you'll see in some of our classic breakdowns on where young people are spending their time. You see YouTube come up a lot, especially amongst young men. Well, here you go. Here's the visual of why maybe we might be seeing young men lean more and more right. This is a scary chart and should scare any of the Democrats on this call. Overall, most of the shows and places that young people are spending their time that they think isn't political actually has a right-leaning guests, right-leaning information that's put out. This is from Media Matters, so you can do your own deep dive if you're ever interested on some of that. But again, it comes from podcasts and shows like YouTube shows that specifically categorize themselves as non-political. And overwhelmingly, we are seeing a lot of right-leaning non-political content. And you can see the breakdown here too when it comes to gaming, business, sports, education, scarily for my healthcare policy side, wellness and health. We're seeing, I myself almost picked up some information when I was thinking it was just on not trusting certain insurance rates and things like that. And little did I know it was actually, I was opening an anti-vax ad. It's really creepy how quickly they can kind of leach into a lot of your world without even realizing it. Next slide, please. So I just want to get into a little bit of what we are recommending and things that we'd really like to partner with folks on. So if anyone is interested, reach out to us. These are things that this team here that was presenting are desperately trying to work on. So I just want to talk through a couple of those because I know we presented some strategies for the future, but also some problems. And I'm not here to just fearmonger. I'm here to also tell you like some solutions and ideas I have for tackling this. So of course, with the digital strategy piece, we need to really better understand how Gen Z determines if a source is reliable and trustworthy, because that seems to be the primary issue for myself as a researcher with Gen Z. We're always asking how likely are you to trust this source, this messenger? We do our favorability scales and things like that. And it just doesn't apply for Gen Z because they're going to inherently be distrusting of some of these sources, especially the types of political messengers we're asking them to test. Those messengers, we're testing them because they don't engage with them. And so obviously they're like, I don't really trust this person. So we need to better understand how they do that. And if our hypothesis on the comment section is correct, then we need to really better understand how we can engage better in some of those comment sections to help validate some of the messages and messengers that we do put out there during campaign season and off season. Next, I have the message and language testing to some of what we talked about earlier, where we do have most of our left-leaning principles. So our most progressive policy points, when I talk about them in our focus groups, and then later you saw even in our surveys where we quantify some of this, when we just talk about them in principle in terms of what they are, what they're doing. I know we use the the environment example, but we also saw it in healthcare. When we actually define and talk about essentially universal healthcare, we hear a lot more folks. Sorry, I just need to move this really quick. We hear a lot more people who, sorry, I'm just moving the poll so I can still see the screen. Sorry. We hear a lot more folks who say, for the universal healthcare example, when we just talk about what it is, they tell us that this is something they'd love to see. These are right-leaning folks. They want to see it everywhere. They believe it's a right. They essentially end up explaining to us universal healthcare, but then before they even finish the sentence, they say, but not universal healthcare though, because that's totally different. And so that's an example of what we see across the majority of our policies. That to me means we need a whole message testing overhaul on some of these policies because we have so many more people that we could get on board, and that extends beyond Gen Z as well. if we just didn't have some of our politicized policy language and pieces. So there's a lot of folks that we can kind of bring together on that and support. Separately, back to some of our electoral work, we have candidate and institutional trust. How can we regain Gen Z trust in Democratic candidates and their ability to follow through on campaign promises? So a lot more work to do there, and especially as candidates begin to introduce themselves into the primaries, there's a lot of testing that we'll have to do on each of those candidates to understand the implications of how that might actually implicate their willingness and motivation to vote or trust in those candidates and therefore the system, because those two things aren't always different to them. And especially with rebuilding trust in voting after 2024, and that it matters. Lastly, a little bit more about tracking attitudes. How do young voters' views change over time and why? We've been working on putting together a young voter tracker and are looking for folks who are also interested in adding questions to our tracker to hopefully get some more monthly keeping track of the pulse to also see how they change over time. There's so much more to cover when it comes to tracking those attitudes. But with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Erica to kick off our Q&A section and start to answer some of your great questions.
Thank you. I will just start from the beginning here. So first, there was the question, are there any gender and racial differences in these data? I'm not sure which slide that was referring to, but overall in this presentation, like we kind of discussed, we are keeping it pretty top level, but of course, there are so many nuances within all different groups of Gen Z by gender, race, whether they live in a city or in a small town, religious identity, sexuality, so many nuances that we love to dig into and expand upon, though this presentation was more focused on the through lines that kind of connect Gen Z and the shared experience more generally. But we're definitely very interested in expanding upon those nuances at HIT. I'll ask the next question here. So can candidates who fit the authentic and solution-focused mold of the desires of Gen Z lose that support if that change is not made? I'll give it a sec. The short answer is yes, there's definitely a lot to lose if that authentic and solution-focused approach is not taken. Does someone else on the team want to?
Yeah, I just add that part of that is also to accomplish reaching Gen Z. So the first half of the battle is actually showing up on their content and where they're scrolling and spending their time. So that's a lot of why we recommend working with and better understanding which messengers to engage with. Because even if your candidate is older, so might not be as authentic for them to kind of do those TikTok dances and the things that it takes to end up on their algorithm, that's where it becomes really useful to work with influencers and messengers that do come from that demographic, where they can more authentically put the message for the candidate in those places. If I'm understanding that question correctly.
I would also add, I think Bernie Sanders is a really great example of an older politician who is widely regarded as a very authentic person and does effectively capitalize on those organic moments. I'm recalling in 2016 that Bernie Sanders thing where like the bird flew up on his podium and they made a whole spiel about that and incorporated that into their marketing. And I thought it was cute at the time.
That's a good example. I'll move on to the next question. So do young voters appreciate that there are multiple overlapping systems that need reform? How do we explain the complexities of systems reform?
But Erica, did you want to jump in first or?
Sure, I like this question. Young voters often really connect the dots between not only so many issues, but so many different systems. And when we talk about one more specific issue, they really do kind of see the bigger picture and how this is, how it's all overlapping and related. This can cause a bit of overwhelm and a bit of the cynicism that anything tangible really happens too, because just the more layers that they see, they do recognize the complexities of this reform, but they think that it should be possible. And it's less about explaining the complexities of the system's reform. But kind of calling out the problems, providing even a simple example of where an action was taken that was kind of challenging the system in some way, like standing up to corporations, putting people before profit in some action, calling out the villain, and leaving the policy weeds and complexity to policymakers. We've done so much research on kind of complex housing and tax policy. And really, we often find through that research kind of how to boil it down to a simple explanation, often with a real world example that increases both understanding of how that works, as well as trust in the messenger that action is being taken. But we also see young voters understand that a lot of these changes that they want to see will take time, but they do think that there are small steps towards that can be taken more immediately. If Ashley
Erica, could I
wanted
jump in?
to go ahead.
I'd also add, I'd recommend not explaining the complexities of systems reform because of how aware they are. Oftentimes it doesn't go well. That's why it kind of comes off as like the finger wagging, like, oh, well, let me explain to you why we can't do this. And so that's why it doesn't sit really well with them. And in fact, the reason why they're saying they want the system to be changed, and system meaning kind of everything, which is a huge ask, is because they know it's so complex and so impossible to do, which is why they don't want to engage with the system. They don't want to engage with voting. They don't want to engage with supporting your candidate, and they don't believe that you're going to do it. So instead of talking back to them and telling them, well, this is what you don't understand, the complexities of that system, and I would recommend instead picking the pieces that you can achieve, no matter how small they are. So like, even if it's free buses in the city, if it's city level, or the small pieces. And I think more of it too is we're not recommending candidates also say that I'm going to completely change our system and we're now going to be a socialist country or anything like that. It's more so acknowledging it. More so acknowledging that they agree that this is a giant system that needs to be changed and is rigged against us. And here's the biting off piecemeal what I'm going to achieve. So I hope that better explains what we covered earlier.
Took the words out of my mouth.
Okay, another question here. Effective polling relies on reaching out to demographics and ways that they are willing to engage and respond. Are you finding that Gen Z responds to surveys and polls at higher or lower rates through different modes than older generations? If so, what modes have we found to be more effective?
Hey, Kevin. Kevin's my old boss. Hey, Kevin. Of course, the modes that we most often rely on is, especially with young people, we do mixed modes. So we like to do mixed mode of text to web and online panel. Oftentimes, we of course prefer text to web when we're doing our candidates and voter file. It's more reliable when we can like trace it back. But when we're taking a more creative approach, when it's not as focused on voter data and having to trace it back to the file, we love to do online panels so that we can we love casting a wide net, I say, and seeing what sticks and then kind of scaling it back from there. But definitely multiple approaches with text to web and online, but it's all about how we can reach them on their phone primarily.
Okay, I'll move on to what I believe is the last question here, unless anyone else has anything else they want to add before we wrap. When Gen Z engages with non-political media that slips in right-wing talking points, do they see those talking points as political, or is the framing so strong that those points don't even have the political label?
I would say they don't have the political label. We'd have to do additional research to, of course, like I need to pull some survey data to fully quantify that. But based off what we know and have been hearing, I'm going to use like the classic Joe Rogan as the example. Still, young men in these groups are still telling us that Joe Rogan's not political and the information they're getting isn't political. But all the guests that he has on and the talking points that they use inherently are overwhelmingly right-leaning. And so that's what makes it so, what's the word, toxic, or like it just makes it so much easier for them to relate because they don't have these like antennas up of like, oh, this is political, let me be super on top of making sure this information's neutral and all of that. We're kind of, in a way, it's catching them off guard because they're just relaxed and listening to something that they think is just a casual podcast or viewing. And so they just get introduced these ideas from so-called experts and things like that, and take it at face value. And that's where the impacts are really happening. And that's why I really want to underscore some of the urgency there for us to start infiltrating more of these like non-political spaces.
Okay, and there was one more question here. How can political candidates show aspects of things they're passionate about, like Zoran loving soccer, to better connect with the Gen Z voter base? I think this has a lot to do with the authenticity piece that we've been talking about. When it is a genuine passion of theirs that will be shared among some Gen Z, it's kind of more showing just like a more personal side. But how exactly to do that, of course, it depends on the person, and would need to do some messaging research on that. Ashley,
Now
if there was
that
anything
we're
else.
in our now that we're in our final minute, I'm just going to wrap up to say thank you all so much for joining us. I really hope we can hear from you all, even if you just have ideas. We'd really like to partner with folks on a lot of this future research, and hopefully we can work together in the future. This is a team of Gen Z folks, and we have so many more people behind the scenes from our other research teams who also lead to a lot of this research, to a lot of these findings that we shared today, from our amazing HitStrat team. So we hope to hear from you all soon, but thank you all so much for joining us today.